So, some shameless self promotion, folks. Again, if you don't follow me on Capital Nachos, I certainly invite you to do so. On to the next thing. Um, we are going to go through basically from primitive to most complex. And again, when you talk about something being primitive or something like that, people think, oh, well, that means that they're not all, that they're less evolved than we are. Okay, yes, but there are some big advantages of being more primitive. We're going to go through it like it normally is said, from primitive to more complex, and we'll start also from the most primitive orders, which is the amphibians. So, the study of herpetology basically goes back to Greek and means the study of crawling things. And, they named it that. And in reality, it is reptiles and amphibians, and they share some commonalities and some big differences. The commonalities are just sure pretty easy. I mean, they're all ectothermic, being they're cold blooded. They all have vertebrates. Most of them, it's very difficult to say all in almost anything. Um, for many of them, uh, again, they come from eggs, although there are different kinds of eggs for each of them. And so that's kind of some of the big differences. So the more primitive, what are the amphibians? And when people think of the word amphibians, they think, okay, well, it's a water and land life. And while it may be that way, in reality, the word amphibian is much more than that. So if I could go with your typical amphibian, and the typical amphibian I think about are actually frogs and toads, because they make up 88% of all the amphibians that we have. And when you go to it, you have an animal, and again, a frog, and its life is usually tied to water, so it goes to the water and it lays its eggs there. Out of those eggs that are laid in the water, for our North American animals, out comes out, a little tadpole, which means toad head, or polywog, which means wiggly head. And that thing right away, at first, it's breathing underwater and it's feeding on plants. The more it eats, the faster it grows, and immediately it starts to grow the back legs first. But it continues still breathing underwater, continues still, eat mostly plant vegetation and so forth. And so it keeps growing. And so the front legs start growing. And then it continues to go through what's called metamorphosis. Meta means change, morph means shape. And so it changes shape. And that's when the big changes happen, because the word amphibian actually means two lives. And the second part of its life is about to start, because it's going from an air breathing animal, I'm sorry, from a water breathing animal to an air breathing animal. And that right there tells you that there's some big changes going on. So where it's finding it easy to breathe underwater, it stops doing it, and now it's having a hard time doing it. You might have seen tadpoles go up to the surface or whatever to gulp air. So that's one of the big changes. And then also, when it was fine eating plant material, vegetation, whatever, now it no longer wants to do that. And so what ends up happening is out pops out this little toad, a froglet or a toadlet, this little tiny guy, and he's changed over and he has a long tail on it. For a few days, he doesn't eat. He basically absorbs a lot of his tail back into his body, and that's what he feeds on. And that's a big change, because the second life is really, you went from an air breather, from a water breather to an air breather, from a plant eater to an animal eater, and that's a huge change. And now there are some commonalities about the different groups of amphibians. One of which being that they all have permeable skin, which means a lot of them can breathe through their skin, that sort of thing as well. And most of them glandular skin, all sorts of things on there. Because many of them can absorb stuff right through the skin, they are wonderful bioindicators, and people look at them. Because when things start going wrong with your frogs and other types of amphibians, then you know that there's something seriously wrong with with the ecosystem living in the pond or whatever it is. Okay, so that basically is what makes up an amphibian. And again, the numbers here, they go up and down because there are lumpers and splitters, but the latest numbers that's accepted by many places are on there. So we have, close to 9,000 different amphibian species. Only 798 or 98 or so are salamanders or newts. That's the order Caudata, which means the tailed ones. They're the tailed amphibians. And then we have the vast majority of them, a little over 7,500 in order of neuro, means tailless ones. And that, as I mentioned, makes up the grand portion of most of our amphibians. Now, there is another group, and so we don't have them locally. I'll just mention them here. Those are the Sicilians. There's a picture of one in there. they're mostly blind or can barely see. They're mostly legless. They live underwater, under the ground or underwater, and so that, since we don't have them around, we won't really look at them too much about it. But then, so there are three orders: the salamanders and newts are what we have, and the frogs and toads are what we have, and that's it. And just so you know, what you might have saw there is that we have so many more of amphibians than Maryland does, and that's kind of important. Whenever I teach some of the Maryland chapters and things like that, we have more than twice as many, and there's lots of reasons for that, which we'll get into in a little bit. But it is kind of interesting to do that. A lot of things that we have because of the different habitats and all this, we have much more so than Maryland does. All right. Okay. So on to the next one. We're going to talk about the most common salamanders because salamanders come first, and just some generalities about salamanders. Salamanders look like lizards. I mean, these long things with tails and so forth, except for two things. Okay, the two things are they have no scales. Okay, they have that membranous glandular skin, and they have no nails. They have no claws on them. Otherwise, they look a lot like lizards do, or something like that. And when you look at them, um, the young ones, most of them that start off in the water, they have gills on them. They look like these little frilly things in the back of their heads, and so forth. But otherwise, they look like very drab looking adults. And again, we have a lot of them, and I just want to mention two very kind of cool things I think about salamanders. One of which is they all can feed. There's no such thing as vegetarian salamander. They all feed on other things. Okay, and that includes each other. They're cannibalistic. And so if you put one a big egg mass of salamander eggs into a tank, they'll hatch out very quickly depending on the water temperature, and very quickly start to eat each other until you have just a few very, very healthy ones. And the ones that are left that are very healthy, if you look at them, they'll be missing pieces of their tail, pieces of their gills, pieces of legs. All of these things will be missing. But that's okay because of all the vertebrate animals, I cannot think of any which have more regenerative abilities than salamanders do. Not only can they regenerate tails, which some other animals can do, such as lizards or whatever, but they can, digits such as fingers. I mentioned their gills. They can lose whole legs and that can regenerate. They can even regenerate organ parts. Some species they lose their eye regenerates, parts of their brain even. And people are studying this because if we can find out how we can regenerate these things, that would be a fantastic type of thing. So that's something that I think is very special about them. The other thing about them is the diversity we have here in our part of the world. When people think of biodiversity, they used to think you go to a rainforest or coral reefs where there's just tons of biodiversity. But if you wanted to learn about salamander diversity, we're kind of it in our area. Here, Tennessee, Kentucky, this is the hotbed of salamander diversity worldwide. In fact, we have, as I mentioned here in the bottom of the site, 59 species out of the world's 798 or so, okay, that are found in Virginia, compared to 21 in Maryland. Now, we have so many of them that when people want to study it, they come here to Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee to study these things because our states have more salamanders than many countries do. I mean, we're just very, very diverse and rich in that. And why does Maryland and other places have less of them? It has to do that salamanders are not good at getting places. In fact, a sidewalk is enough. A big, huge river is enough to isolate them. And because they don't get very far, they end up speciating very quickly. They inbreed quite a bit. Many of them are not very mobile. And because of all this inbreeding, you come up with brand new species. And in fact, Virginia has some endemic species, meaning endemic means it's found nowhere else but in Virginia. So, and it's caused by the isolation of where they live. So, for example, the peaks of otter salamander is only found at the peaks of otter, and they're isolated to the top of the peaks of otter. They cannot go much lower than that, and so forth. The Shenandoah salamander are only found in Shenandoahs. So that is one of the big things. So, anyways, that's in general about salamanders. On to next thing. The very next salamander to talk about is our largest salamander, spotted salamander, and he's aptly named. It's basically a dark salamander with spots on him. Most of the time, these spots are in rows, but every in a certain population, the salamanders, their spots and everything are kind of like fingerprints. In fact, people who study them, they basically take pictures of them, and because they're long-lived species, I mean, we had at least one that lived at least 27 years. It probably lived longer than that. And you take the picture, and you can tell what it is by the number of spots and where their locations are. I've seen some which have almost no spots; they're practically melanistic. And I've seen other ones where you have so many spots you don't see almost any dark on them, and that's a spotted salamander. This is a vernal pool species, meaning that they do go to basically glorified puddles, these places that hold water for 2 or 3 months out of the year, and that's where they develop. To do so, and the reason they do so is because fish are a big danger to them. Nothing is more dangerous to salamanders than fish do, and so if they go to a pool full of fish, they die because the ponds, the vernal pools, dry up in the summertime. Fish can't live there, and that's why they go in there. But that also means, though, that the ponds dry up quickly, which means they have a race. They got to get there before the pond dries out. And that's a huge thing. So to get there as early as possible. The earliest I've seen them lay eggs that I've seen personally is January 31st. Most of the time, they're out there very late February, beginning of March, and they'll come in there and they want to lay their eggs first. There's another reason you want to be there first, not just because the pond's going to dry up, because even if the pond dries up, you can't speed up your metamorphosis. Doing so leaves you at a great big disadvantage because you're smaller, other things can feed on you, things like that. But the other reason they do it is because they want to beat each other to it. Because the first ones in there to lay their eggs will be the first ones out there, and then they can feed on whatever else is hatching after that. So there's a big incentive to get there as soon as you can. So, anyways, these are vernal pool salamander. I mean, the vernal pool salamanders. They're called mole salamanders because they live most of their life underground, except for this brief time when they come out to their natal pools, which again they can get in there. And by the way, they can tell there's fish in there because that skin that they have, they can chemically detect if there's fish in there, which is how they also chemically detect a certain species of algae. And that algae is completely tied in to spotted salamander. So they go to their exact same pond where they started. But it's more than that because now they find out that they actually hold some of the algae within them. And that's kind of a cool thing because when they go to a new pond, they can actually uh, have that algae then colonize it thanks to them being in there. So anyway, they're very closely tied with symbiotic relationship with this algae, which gives them cover, gives them air, all of these kinds of things. So that's a spotted salamander, very cold tolerant, a wonderful thing. On to next one. And the next one is probably the one salamander. If you want to learn the most common salamander, one that's that you're likely to find, it's going to be this one, the eastern redback salamander. Eastern redback salamander is a terrestrial salamander, and it does something that's very, very different from most other salamanders worldwide, but is actually fairly common here in Virginia. It's a lungless salamander. It does not breathe through gills or whatever like that, like the spotted salamander does. As a matter of fact, it basically breathes right through its skin, as I mentioned before, that permeable skin. At first, they come in a variety of different colors. You can see some of them right here. And people thought that there were multiple species. There's redbacks, and they thought, oh my God, there's leadbacks. But now we find out they both come from the same egg mass, things like that. And that's kind of a cool thing. Um, because they're terrestrial, meaning that they don't go very far. In fact, for one of these, just a few yards is their whole universe. They don't get very far, so they don't go to water or anything like that. They basically find moist areas and live underneath there. So if you were to roll over a rock or I should say a log or something like that, something that keeps moisture, and you see a salamander, it's a really good bet that it's an eastern redback salamander, which is this guy right here. And again, their whole life is in that small little area, which is important because if somebody were to clear cut a forest or something, it would take over 40 years for these guys to get back in there because they don't move very far. They stay in that small little yards long area their whole life. So, anyways, this is the most common one. And while they're variable up top, if you were to look at their belly, you have the peppered little mark on them, and that's a good field ID if you happen to catch one and roll them over. But be careful whenever you catch any kind of amphibians, that permeable skin. If you got bug spray on you, if you got suntan lotion, if you're a smoker or something like that, when you grab them, all that stuff is absorbed within the salamander. I told you they're wonderful bioindicators, right? So please, these are not things that you can hand around, pass around, or things like that. You have to be very, very careful, because when you handle them, you could be very much disturbing their skin and causing great injury to them by whatever is on your hands. On to the next one, please. So if you have to memorize one stream salamander, it's this one, the northern two-line salamander. It's the most adaptable of all of our aquatic salamanders. It lives in streams. It's active pretty much year-round. An identifying feature on this one is has these dark racing stripes along the side that you can see right on your screen there. And they're very, very cool little salamanders, and they're very tolerant to different things. They're so tolerant that oftentimes in urban streams, it's the only salamander it can survive. It can survive great changes in temperature, both hot and cold, for when warm rains comes in there. It can handle a lot more chemicals than the other ones. So by virtue of it being the most adaptable and it's the last one to survive, that's why it's found in many of our streams as sometimes the only salamander that are found in our streams. So that's a northern two-line salamander, the most common brook salamander that we have. On to the next one, please. Oh, actually, right now, let's stop a second. Before we do that, I'm finishing up with salamanders, and it was a very general thing. But are there any questions about salamanders before we move on to more common one? Oh, okay. So I will check the chat then. Thank you. I just realized that you
There
can.
is one question. It says, do lead-backed salamanders interbreed with the red-backed form?
Yes, they absolutely do, because they're the same thing. They're, as I mentioned, they're from the same from the same bunch of eggs. Out will come out yet another salamander. So you can have a bunch of eggs, and both redbacks, leadbacks, some yellowbacks, all of them come in from the same batch of eggs. And by the way, this is the time when, if you lift up a log or something like that, they usually attach their eggs to the top of a log. This is when they're actually breeding. And all of the metamorphosis takes place within the egg. Okay. So what comes out is a miniature looking adult, but they can mate with each other all the time. In some locations, because they're kind of inbred or whatever, one is much more common than the other. But in reality, you could have both of them born from the same batch of eggs. Okay.
And
I
there's one more question, and it's not about salamanders, it's about newts. It's asked if you could please say something about red-spotted newts.
Certainly. So newts are different. They have an interesting life pattern and everything else. So the difference from newts, as opposed to, for example, the salamanders that we've been talking about, is that they have an intermediate stage in their life. Okay, so they have the larval form, which is much like the spotted salamander I showed you with the gills and so forth, and that lasts about a summer. And by the end of it, out comes the land form. The land form has much drier skin. It's usually very, very orangey or red to it, and is very, very toxic. And it can wander quite a long ways away from land, but it's not an adult yet. It can wander way far away from its initial pond that it lived in, and it depends on its toxicity to keep animals from feeding on it. After a few years, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years maybe, it'll find another place, go back to the water, and then changes into adult, which is the red spotted newt that we have. And that's when it can live a few more years, it can reproduce or something like that. So the difference between a newt and many of the other salamanders we're talking about is they have the intermediate stage. It's called the F stage. The F stage is a land stage where, again, it lives completely on land for several years and is fairly toxic before it goes back to the water. And that's the difference between a salamander and a newt. Although all of them are salamanders. It's just the newts are a particular type of stage of salamander with that intermediate stage, the land stage. Okay, so if there are no more questions, we move on to frogs. And again, we're only going to cover the most common frogs. And again, you'll notice we got more than Maryland does. On to the first frogs. The very first frog is the green frog, and I will um, mention the green frog as being the most common of all of our frogs. It's the first ones to, it's usually one of the first ones to basically find a new pond. You can find them in streams, and you can find them in even wet meadows, things like that. They're pioneer frogs, and they go into brand new areas. Oh, I should mention something else about this. And I've included here, and if anybody has a copy of my book, they probably know this too. A few years ago, uh, many of the groups got together to standardize all of the names for the species. And this isn't just the scientific names; they standardize all the common names. So when you're talking about a green frog, which our version, our subspecies used to be called the northern green frog. Now it's all standardized. A green frog is a green frog, no matter what it is, and even the standard name has been changed. And a lot of the scientific names were also standardized too. So where it was rana, now rana is an old war species. We don't have our ranas here in North America. So, but you would if you go to Europe or whatever. And rana was easy. I'm Latino, so rana means frog. That was an easy one. So now they changed a lot of it. Okay, so green frogs. Formerly called northern green frogs. They're the most common ones. Big thing about it is that they wander quite a bit, and color is the wrong thing. This happens all the time. People, I know that we're so color oriented that we look at everything, we decide what color is like a good field mark, but in reality, it's just one clue. You should not make a decision just based solely on color. You should look at all the other factors that make up what it is, where it's found, what size it is, what all of these kinds of things, as well as color. Okay, because they can come like look at the bottom corner there. You see two tadpoles. They're both green frog tadpoles, but they're both very different in color. So color is the worst thing to do to look at because it's the most variable thing that there is. But anyways, green frogs are mostly green. And they wander from place to place. A good identification feature is what's called the dorsolateral fold. And as you see there, there's a little white arrow above it. It's basically a fold of skin that goes about 2/3 of the way down their body. And that is a good way of telling you that it's a green frog as opposed to one of the other ones. Now, another big thing is with green frogs and bullfrogs, those two species, you can easily tell the males from the females by looking at the tympanum, the eardrum. If the eardrum is larger than the eye, as you can see in the top left picture, then it's a male. If it's about the same size as the eye, then it's a female. On adult green frogs, both bullfrogs and green frogs, it's very easy to tell the sexes by just looking at the eardrum and seeing what that is. So a very, very common frog, the green frog. On to the next one. So if the green frog was the most common, the largest one we have is the American bullfrog, and this lives in permanent bodies of water. And it breaks almost all the rules for frogs in general. In general, frogs, the females are larger than the males. Why? Because the larger the female, the more eggs they can hold. So there's a competitive edge for being larger. Okay, except bullfrogs, where because they bully each other around, they wrestle each other. All this being a big male means that you have the better territory, and so that's changed. In most frogs and toads, the females basically the girls make all the noise. Okay, the boys are quiet. Okay, I'm sorry, the boys make all the noise. The girls are quiet. And so if you hear a chorus of frogs, what you're listening to are basically just the boys calling. Okay, in fact, calls are a wonderful way to identify them. And with some species, the only way you can tell them apart is by their call. Okay, so anyways, that's true of everyone except bullfrogs, where many of the females also call. And so that's a different story. In all the other ones, it takes about one season for them to metamorphose from a tadpole to an adult. Slightly different. It sometimes, occasionally, a green frog will lay its eggs late. You might get one that has back legs or everything like that over the wintertime, but it's rare. Bullfrogs, though, it takes 2 or 3 years for them to change over. And that's a huge difference because, again, they live in these permanent bodies of water. So they break the mold for just about everything else. Now, bullfrogs are not found anywhere, and that's a big, huge thing. People assume that just because it's native, it should be found everywhere, and that's not the case. A bullfrog is a mighty predator. It eats anything smaller than itself, including other frogs. And so a lot of people that have ponds or something, the easiest frog for them to get are bullfrogs because it takes 2 or 3 years. So it's easy to go to a place that sells frogs, a pet store, or one of these nurseries. And what they have on hand are bullfrogs because they're there year round. And they put them in their own ponds. And then they wonder why nothing else comes into their pond. Why? Because the bullfrog's eating anything that comes to their pond because in a small pond, he's the king. He will eat anything that comes in there. So just because they're native does not mean it's found everywhere. Okay. So, anyways, that's the American bullfrog, our largest frog. And on to the next slide, we'll show you a difference again of how to tell them apart. As I mentioned before, with the green frog on the bottom, you can see the dorsolateral fold goes part way down the back. Okay. But it's not the case with the bullfrog. In the bullfrog, the dorsolateral fold goes around the eardrum, and that's pretty important a way of telling them apart because they're when they're first growing up, bullfrogs and green frogs can look very very similar, except for that. Now, granted, you do need a good look at it to tell that apart, but it is a good field mark if you need to do that. On to the next one. Excuse me. So we're looking at toads, and again, I'm just combining all the two species of toads that we have together. We have the most common one called the American toad, and then we have the Fowler's toad, a little bit smaller, and it has when you see spots on them, if it has one or two warts per spot, then what you have is American toad. If it has spots on there and there are more than two, three, four, five, whatever warts per spot, then you end up having a Fowler's toad. However, they can mate with each other. In fact, they'll mate with anything. I've been to vernal pools when everything is just the right stimulus for a lot of species we got there. I've seen them trying to mate with salamanders, with green frogs, with wood frogs, anything that they can wrap their legs around. They'll try to mate with. So and that means that they'll mate with other toads too, even though they basically are their calls are a few weeks apart from each of them. So they're there. In fact, I even tried to take a GoPro video of them underground. As soon as I stuck my GoPro under him, guess what? He tried to mate with the GoPro. So, I mean, these are everywhere. So, toads are different because they all have what's called a parotoid gland. That big bump behind their head is actually a poison gland which protects them, which means that because they're like that, they don't need to be very good jumpers. They hop from place to place. They're not really good jumpers. They have shorter back legs. And because they're farther away from the water, they tend to have thicker skin that can stand out drying a little bit more. And when they lay their eggs, they also lay their eggs in long strings. Okay. They school together when they're working. So if you ever see like a school of black little tadpoles all going together, those are toad tadpoles because the siblings, the ones that come from the same egg string, all hang out together and school together. So ever see that happening, that is what it is. So before we move on to, we'll wrap up here with the amphibians just real quick. Are there any questions of people as far as, what we talked about, frogs?
There are a couple questions in the chat. The
Okay.
first one, I'm not sure if it applies to the salamanders or the amphibian, the frogs and toads, but it says,
Okay.
how long does it take them to find and populate a new wildlife pond? And there's a second part, do both males and females travel to a new pond together?
Yeah. So here you go. Here goes the first answer, right, Glenda? It depends. It depends on the species. So for frogs and toads, some species such as the green frog are very likely to happen. I have a little 100 pond. I mean, it's just 100 gallons. It's a little tiny little pond, and it sprung a leak. So when it sprung a leak, it's bad news, all this kind of stuff. And by the time I filled it, which was a year later, I fixed it, whatever. I knew that gray tree frogs were nearby and they'd come and use it, and they did. What I did not know was the green tree frogs from somewhere, and I'm in suburbia here in Alexandria, from somewhere, green frogs. I have 5 of them now in my pond that have come in from out of nowhere. So they're very good at colonizing. The other ones, not so much. So, for example, for spotted salamanders, they as long as their vernal pool is there, they'll go to it and they know it's their vernal pool because they can kind of sense that the algae's in there and use it again. So unless that pond is filled up or something happened to it, they won't try to find another one. But if they do, then they'll go out there first and they'll go in there, see if there's any fish, and they'll try to use it then. And then that becomes their normal pool. The males are the first to colonize and go to places, the females much less so. The males are just trying to find new opportunities and things like that, and so they're more likely to do it. So it really depends on the species and whether you have the right thing. So, for example, if you're trying to get any of the vernal pool species, you got to have everything in there. I mean, if you want wood frogs, marble salamanders, spotted salamanders, whatever, you need mature woods that have been there for a long time, and this fishless pool that holds water for 2 or 3 months. If you don't have both of them together, you're never going to get them to get there. That's just not the case. Whereas if you put in like a farm pond, like a little garden pond like me, heck, the green frogs found it in one season. It's just kind of, and so did the great tree frogs. They'll find them very, very easy. So it really depends on the species. Okay.
Next
Next one.
question is, what is the difference between toads and frogs?
So as I mentioned, the big true difference is the parotid gland, that big gland behind their back that you can see in this picture over here. That big thing, that is the poison gland. And that's the big, most obvious reason between a toad and the frog. Um, Frogs don't have the parotid gland. Other big differences, toads tend to have thicker, wartier skin than frogs do. Frogs tend to have longer jumping legs than toads do, and then there's a whole bunch of internal stuff, Biden's organ stuff like that, that you can't tell. It's not an ID thing, marine teeth, but these are things that you don't see. You can't use as a field guide. So the big things, look for the big parotid gland, the big thing in the back of their thing, and that tells you it's a toad. Okay.
Next question is, do they lay so many eggs because most of them get eaten?
Yes, although something again, the answer is it depends, and it depends on the species. So, for example, many things will eat the eggs, but toad eggs, they they are distasteful to many different things, and so they are more likely to lay them in odd places. However, they are tasty to other things. So, for example, a toad string tastes great to wood frogs. So they don't want to lay their eggs in places where wood frogs are because they're basically feeding the wood frogs. So that's why they go to tire ruts and less than ideal spots to lay their eggs. But even if they lay them in a pond, the fish and things like that don't like to eat those eggs because they don't taste very good. So it depends on the species. Different species have different ways of protecting their eggs by being distasteful and things like that. So it just depends on which species you're talking about. Okay. Anything
Okay,
else?
not yet.
Great. Okay, so let's wrap up quickly with reptiles. And the thing with reptiles is there's a lot. One back up if you don't. One more above there. Yeah, that one right there. So reptiles, and again, we're only going to talk about the ones in the top, which are snakes, the lizards, and the turtles, which we have. We don't have tuatars; they're only found in a couple of islands near New Zealand and so forth. They look like lizards, but they're different metamorphically, same size teeth. They have a third eye, and that gets covered over this kind of thing. So it's a different thing altogether. They date way back, and of course, we don't have any crocodilians, although people have released them every once in a while. And we won't have Amphibians, which are worm lizards. This scaled things with very with vestigial eyes that have this, they have these little rings around them or whatever. They don't have them in our country, but we do have the top ones. And that's what we're going to look at. And again, if you look at them, we again have many more species than Maryland does. On to the first thing, and the more primitive art groups are the turtles, and these are some of the turtles we'll look at. First one is the next one, please. The woodland box turtle. And again, here, when they standardize the name, I want to let you know they used to call them eastern box turtles, okay? But now they found out that they're the same species as some of the other ones that we have. They mate with each other, and so they've lumped them all together into woodland box turtles. Although our subspecies is Terrapina carolina, which is originally the eastern ones. This is a completely land turtle. Um, they don't live in the water, although they do like to take long baths or whatever, soak up water when they can. It is called a box turtle because it can close up like a box. There's a hinge on the bottom which allows it to close up. And like many turtles, for most turtles, they start off eating meat to begin with, and then they quickly change over to more, feeding on all sorts of omnivorous diet, of feeding just about everything else. Okay. In fact, they can feed on anything, including poisonous berries and poisonous mushrooms. And one of the first laws passed in New York to supposedly protect turtles was actually more to protect people, because people during the Great Depression were eating turtles, and many of them were dying. But why? Or getting sick because they were eating turtles that had poisonous mushrooms or poisonous berries, and therefore they were getting poisoned. But again, they can do this now. People do eat them, and people have for the longest time. And Native people, when if you look back in the day, especially here in Virginia, most of our villages in our area were Algonquian speaking villages, the Powhatans, the Kanoi on the Maryland side, all of this. Um, if you were to go to a village, you would find almost no turtles anywhere near there and no deer anywhere near there. Why? Because the people will go out there and hunt them. And they were easily eating the turtles without a problem. But what they think they did was they would actually hold on to the turtle for a while, let it clear its system, and then they'd eat them. And then one of the other big advantages being primitives, you don't have to keep your body warm, therefore you don't have to eat very much. And that's why you can put them in there and not feed them for days, and guess what? They're fine. There's not a problem with them. So that's the woodland box turtle, our most common land turtle that we have. And the next one is our most common water turtle, eastern painted turtle. Beautiful little turtle. Big identification things on this. It's behind its eyes are two light spots. That's the easiest way to tell them apart. And they're very very cool, medium sized turtles. They're very flat shelled. On the males, when they're full grown, their front claws are really really long. If you see a flat shelled water turtle with really really long nails, it's a male. They're very cold tolerant. They're found in most of our ponds. Again, they feed on. They start off feeding on more protein first, and then switch over to a more omnivorous diet. A very very common turtle. And then the next most common turtle is one more after this is the red-eared slider, which is unfortunately much larger than ours. Yeah, one back up to the red-eared slider. Yeah, that one right there. Go ahead and click that one if you don't mind. That's the red-eared slider.
I it's not
It's
it,
not popping up.
no. I don't
Okay.
know why.
Okay.
I
All right.
see
No. No.
it. I can see it. I just can't. There it goes.
Okay. There it is.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
So no worries. Okay, so red-eared slider. So this is an introduced turtle. It was introduced. It's really a basically from the Midwest, and it was the pet store turtle. And people would release their turtles, and now it's the most common turtle worldwide. I've been to Bahamas and Central America, and I find these turtles. They're everywhere because people release them as pets, and that's bad because not only can introduce diseases, but they compete with our native turtles. They're bigger than, for example, our native painted turtle. They use the same things. They're eating the same things. They're trying to nest in the same places. They're trying to use the same basking areas. All of these kinds of things, but they're bigger, so they win out on that war a lot more. But even more so, they'll breed with one of our other turtles, the yellow-bellied slider. And when they breed with the yellow-bellied slider, they form this intergrade. You end up with something which is not one or the other. And now, if you go down south, like in the Tidewater area, good luck finding a yellow-bellied slider because it's been mostly bred out of existence because of the introduction of red-eared sliders. So red-eared sliders, easiest way to identify them is again that red little splotch behind their eye, but that can disappear, particularly in males, because in many water turtles, the older they get, the more darker melanistic that they get. And so sometimes it's hard to tell them apart. But that's a good field mark if you were to look at them. And then one more, please. So we'll wrap up the turtles with the snapping turtle, our largest water turtle that we have. It's big. It also lays more eggs than any other ones. Its shell does not cover in completely. In fact, the scientific serpentina means serpent-like, but has a really long neck and a really long tail. But it can't fit inside of its shell. In fact, its shell is very, very. It's called lunaris. There's very spaces on there which just have scales but don't have bone on them, and so it's not very protected. And therefore, its best defense is a good offense, but only when it's on land. When it's in the water, they're incredibly shy. They don't do this, but on land, people do. Now, this is one that grows very, very quickly and was for a while they're one of the favorites for making turtle soup and turtle stew, whatever. But because they're studying now to see if they really can sustain that. They've now made it you can't sell these outside of the country because that's a big deal now because they were being sold to other places, and now you can locally harvest them and eat them, but you can't sell them anywhere else while they study to see if you can if they're able to eat this. One big thing, people always blame these guys for eating fish or eating waterfowl, ducks and whatever. And while that's dramatic and they undoubtedly do eat a few, it happens very, very rarely. But they actually feed on plants the vast majority of the time because they're so big. That's the easiest thing for them to get. And whenever I'm at Huntley, I point out to people these things eating the plant material because they're not feeding on these other things. But when one does, it makes all the papers. It calls a lot of attention, and people point to it, but it's not a common practice. So that's turtles in a turtle shell. Are there any questions about turtles before we wrap things up with the last couple of slides?
Yes, there are a couple.
Okay.
Um, First one is should or can we anything be done to deal with the non-native turtles?
It is an invasive, and so for example, people who rehab turtles, they rarely take them in because they tie up space the other turtles can be. And that means also that if you wanted to don't people buy them, they're oh, what do I do with them? Well, guess what? Most nature centers have enough that zoos don't want them, anything like that. And some of them will put them down, But right now they're just about everywhere. There's not a lot that we can do. They kind of become commonplace, unfortunately.
The next one I think you answered, but it says, how do turtles compete with one another, i.e., sliders versus painted?
Yeah, and I did answer it. I mean, they're bigger and they use the same resources. Therefore, a big thing about being invasive is that you either cause ecological harm or economic harm. In this case, ecological harm. You are competing for the same things. Therefore, the other one, the native one, which is smaller, is losing out.
And the next is more a comment. It says, let people know not to pick snappers up by their tail.
Yes, it's a bad idea. I know if you see a turtle crossing the road, it is good. Help them cross the road to the other side. However, grabbing them by the tail is a terrible idea because it's connected to their spine, and they'll spin around trying to defend themselves, and that can cause spinal damage. If you do grab them, you don't want to grab them near the top. You want to grab them near the back, and you can slowly pull them along or lift it very gently from back there, but don't grab it straight up by the tail. Some people just put them on top of a car mat or something and pull the car mat across. But yes, you don't want to pull them by the tail because that will occasionally cause spinal damage that really hurts the turtle. Okay.
Okay, that's all of them for now.
Okay. So the next one is our lizards, and again, we have more lizards than obviously Maryland does. But we're just going to concentrate on the most common ones, which are the skinks. And I want to mention the skinks are basically those little lizards that have the blue tails. Okay, and I want to say we have three local species of skinks. All of them have five stripes on their back. All of them have blue tails when you start off with. So if you see one that's out there, it could be any of those three. The most common one's the common five-line skink, but they all start off the same. The older they get, then there's some differences. The males start to lose their stripes more. In some of them, like for example, one of the broad-headed skink, they're much larger than the other ones. But when they first start off, the best you can do if you don't have them in your hand, that then you can count scales or stuff like that, say that it's a skink. Okay, and that's about it. All of our native lizards feed on insects. They're all predators too. So that's it for that. And unless there's a question about that, we'll go on the snakes. Great. Okay, so snakes it is. Again, we got more than Maryland. Go figure. So the very first snake we're going to talk about is the most common snake. That is the decay snake, which used to be called the northern brown snake. And again, one big thing I want to point out over here. So notice brown snake is all one word. That's because it's all made up of that one family. When you're talking a brown snake, you're not talking a snake that's brown. It's standardized. It is that family of snakes. Okay. Same thing with rat snakes, brown snakes, king snakes. They all are one word because you're specifically the common name has been simplified that you're talking about that one family of animals. So this is the most common stick we have. And even though they grow 19 inches, in reality, most of them don't get more than 8 or 9. Many people kill them off because they have a pattern on them. They have a dark head and a pattern on them, but these are harmless little snakes. And right now, people find them all the time in their gardens. Why? Because they like to feed on worms. And then in the winter, now that it's getting to be fall, they're looking for a place to hide. That could be, to them, our houses look like good places to hide, but they're harmless. They can't really hurt you. Best way to tell them apart: the decay snake, the northern brown snake, has paired spots down his back and has a dark head, and again, completely harmless. That's the decay's brown snake. On to the next one. So okay, I think. Okay, yeah. So this is the largest snake we have, the eastern rat snake, what used to be called the black rat snake. And again, we found out that because it can mate with many other ones, the yellow rat snake and stuff like that. In reality, they lumped them all together into just eastern rat snake and they sometimes called the eastern rat snake complex because it's a whole complex of different kinds of snakes that can mate with each other. Okay. So, anyways, it's a neat snake, very, very large. It's the only snake we have. If you see a snake that's over 5 feet long or something, it's an eastern rat snake. You don't have any other snakes that regularly grow any bigger than that are common. They're arboreal, so they're just as happy being on the ground as above the ground. And they'll eat on anything. They're constrictors, and any animal they can bite, they'll grab it, constrict it, and that is their food. They start off looking very, very different. On the bottom, you can see that they have a pattern, and the best way to tell the young ones from the old ones is if you look at the young ones, they have like a unibrow, basically a dark line that connects the two eyes, like a long eyebrow across the top or whatever. That is one way of telling them. Now, about 40 some percent of our snakes rattle their tail, and this is one of them. They'll take them in there and they shake their tail, and in the leaves it sounds like a rattle. That used to be a great defense. A fox came by, the little snake that has the pattern will sit there, strike at it, hiss, and do all this kind of stuff and rattle its tail. But now it backfires because people see that it's striking at me, whatever. They think it's deadly, dangerous, and they kill the snake, which is unfortunate because it really is a harmless snake. On to the next one. So this is our state reptile, the eastern garter snake, and the most adaptable snake. It can be found in water, into meadows, woodlands, anything you can. They can have, mostly they have three stripes down their back, but in reality you can get checkered ones too. You can see in the bottom right. They're incredibly not only very adaptable to habitat, but they're very adaptable at anything they eat. Fish, worms, frogs, toads, anything, mice, whatever they can find. They're very, very cold tolerant. You'll see them just about, and I've seen them year round. I mean, they're incredibly cold tolerant. That's our eastern garter snake. And again, notice garter snake is all one word because we're talking about that family of snakes. So that's the eastern garter snake. On to the next one. Oh, okay. I think we skipped one. The copperhead. No? Oh, I
No.
forgot to include it. Okay, that was dumb. Well, go back to the book. so the so go back to the, yeah, right there. So this is my book, and I do. If you ever see me, I always have them on me. And this is an old one. This is the old edition, 2016. But regardless, this is what a copperhead looks like. And a lot of people say, well, how can you tell a copperhead? It's the only, here within the Beltway, it's the only venomous snake we have. Having said that, nobody's ever died of a copperhead bite in Virginia. Okay, and it's very rare that it's ever happened. I've only heard of one case of it happening. It was really bad luck. Some sheriff fell into hibernaculum where tons of snakes were overwintering, not just copperheads, but other snakes too. Fell into a whole bunch of them. He got bit multiple times all over his body. Just really bad luck, and he died. But that's the only case I've ever heard of anyone ever dying with a snake. But if you do get bit, it is necrotic. You should get yourself to a doctor. None of this sucking the poison out. Don't do any of that. But you go to a doctor, they'll take care of you. And they're unlikely to give you any antivenom because antivenom is made from horse serum, and some people do have an allergic reaction to that. And if you get an allergic reaction to horse serum, that'll kill you. Whereas in the copperhead bite may be painful and so forth. It likely will not kill you. So it's unlikely to happen. So how do you identify them? All sorts of different things. One, people realize that it's a pit viper, and therefore there's this little pit right in front of its eyes. Other people say, well, it's got cat-like eyes, like a slit-like eye on them, which can change depending on the light. Now, if you're that close to either seeing its pit, its heat sensing pit or its eyes, you're way too close. Okay, that's the wrong thing to do. In reality, you don't have a good picture of it here. Their backs have what's called the Hershey kiss pattern. It basically, they're skinny at the very, very top, and they widen as they get along the sides. Some people call it butterfly wings. Some people call it horseback, saddleback marks, whatever the case may be. That's the best way of telling them apart from other kinds of snakes. Okay, so there is that. So that's the only venomous snake that we have locally, and they're not that common, but we still have them. And again, you want to be careful about them, but it's certainly not. It's not anything that's going to kill you. And so I'm going to do just two more slides, and then I'll take whatever questions left over. But the very next slide, I just want to talk about that. So recently, my 6-year-old said to me, "Dad, those turtles are playing piggyback," and I knew it was time to have the talk. Son, I said, those are tortoises, not turtles. If you're not talking to your kids about herpetology, who is? So, folks, again, there are not a lot of things out there. You can become a very, very proficient in learning these animals very, very quickly because there's not that many of them. And by the way, yes, tortoises are just another kind of land turtle. But again, there are neat things out there. I refer you, if you see me, I do have my book for sale. If not, the Virginia Herpetological Society has wonderful little resource, including calls for the frogs and things like that. So there's lots to that. We go on to the last slide because I want people to kind of look at my self-promotion here while I answer whatever last remaining questions there may be concerning any stuff that we had talked about today. So any questions, folks, go ahead. I'll be happy to say I don't know.
And if you want to raise your hand, using the raise hand button, feel free to do that too. And I can call on you, but there are a couple questions in the chat. The
Thank you.
first is, what non-native lizards are present?
Okay, if you're talking Virginia, okay, Virginia as opposed to Maryland, there are two non-native lizards present. One of which is found locally, okay, locally in Arlington, Alexandria, and that is the house gecko, Mediterranean gecko, which came in on plants, and it basically lives on you know in warm places. The where I found them, they was found in Alexandria maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and a couple of years ago finally moved into Arlington. They live in they live basically in apartments where it's nice and warm. They like to hang out, especially in the laundry rooms and stuff like that, where it's really humid. And they're not really. I think unless there's always the case that something could bring in an infection or something, some kind of disease. But in reality, they don't really compete with ours because they use an unused niche. They're basically living inside our homes, feeding on cockroaches and other non-native things and things like that, and so aren't causing any real harm. That's one. There is another one which is only found in a very small section of Loudoun County, the Italian wall lizard. Unless you go to that one little spot where it's found, you're not going to find them anymore. Um, so there is that. And then the last one, which is not found this far north, but further south in southern Virginia, is the green anole, which again has come up on plants and has found the niche here, and can be found growing yet again. So those are that's basically the only non-native lizards that we have.
The
Okay.
next question is, where can we see these?
Well, you got to go to the right habitat, right? So it depends on the time of year and the right habitat. Like, for example, if you look for salamanders in the middle of summer, you are likely not to find any. Why? Because they estivate. They go into a dormant state underground for many of them. So even the ones where if you would go in the fall or early spring and roll over a log, you might find 3 or 4 redback salamanders. You won't find any in the summertime. They're all gone. So when it's seasonal, and it depends on being the right habitat. And some it's very much the right habitat. If it's a water type of snake, like a water snake, if there's no water, you're never going to find them. I mean, you just have to go to the proper habitat. So it depends on the habitat and the species of what you're trying to find. I mean, that's bottom line is, if you go to a diverse habitat, that's why, for example, I like to lead my walks over Huntley Meadows, which has multiple different kinds of habitat. Then you're much more likely to find lots of different ones because we're going from habitat to habitat to habitat looking for them. And again, please be careful. If you're in a park, please don't, you shouldn't be handling stuff. You shouldn't do anything like that. When I go out there, I have a scientific collecting permit. We get permission from the park to do so. But again, if you're grabbing amphibians, you could be causing them harm. So please be very, very cautious. And the other big thing, it's illegal to move things from one place to another. And part of it has to do with many different chytrid, especially a certain type of disease. And if you introduce a disease, either because on your boots you didn't clean your boots, or you didn't clean your jar, or you use something, or you introduce an animal that's sick, you could wipe out a whole population. Chytrid has already wiped out over 100 different species of frogs worldwide. Okay, and and now that's one of the reasons you're not allowed to move amphibian and not allowed to move amphibians from one place to another. There are several diseases like that, ranavirus, whatever, which are very spread. And so you moving things from one place to another, or you dumping water or handling things the wrong way, can cause a very serious issue of killing either the individual animal or whole population. So please be careful about that.
Next question is, what can we do to support reptiles and amphibians?
Well, first of all, the big thing, and I think Alan, you're happy here, is plant native plants because it supports a lot of the insects and other things that later on supports the actual reptiles and amphibians themselves. Okay, so that's the first thing. Another big thing is protect support the parks and protect those parks. When it comes up to or whatever, protect those parks so we don't have, we're not developing things and things like that as well. And then if you really want to do things, join the Virginia Herpetological Society, where you can learn more about these different kinds of things and do and different ways you might do it. They have different kinds of surveys. So if you find a box turtle, you can report it to them. That sort of thing. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that. But again, if you look at the Virginia Herpetological Society site, they've got, for example, some ideas there of what you can do to support things in Virginia.
Next question is, where can we buy your book?
I have it with me almost everywhere that I go. I will have it with me, for example, when I'm traveling to Huntley Meadows to do my walk on Saturday. Um, and but more so than that, I'll have it for sale at Wolf Trap when we do the Bat Festival. This is Bat Week, right? So the Bat Festival, the first annual Bat Festival at Wolf Trap from 3 to 6 this Sunday. Free registration. There's over 700 people signed up for it. You guys are welcome to come along, and I'll have both my T-shirts and my book for sale there.
And that event is free, by the way.
It is. It's free. Absolutely.
Yes, so please come. And next question is, are there venomous water moccasins in
No,
Virginia?
they are in Virginia, but not this far north. They got to go to southeastern portion of Virginia, and they go. People all they always misidentify water snakes, and they call it a water moccasin, cottonmouth. We're too far north for that. And by the way, there are no water moccasins or cottonmouths, and there probably has not been historically any in Maryland at all. Okay, but if you go to the southeastern portion of Virginia, there are water moccasins and cottonmouths, and further south you go, but up in here we do not have any. They just this is the wrong habit. It's too cold. They don't survive up here.
Next question is, can you give us some tips on how to educate the public to appreciate amphibians and reptiles, e.g., people who are afraid of snakes?
Yeah. Again, you have to mention to them again that it's very unlikely. So first of all, any kind of snake or something is not going to attack you. It's going to try to move or whatever, because any fight, even like the copperhead, any fight that starts is going to lose. I can easily stamp on it. I kill the thing. Granted, I may get bit or something, but I'll kill the thing. So these animals are going to start a fight with you because they're always going to lose. So if you leave them alone, then that's the best. Uh, Most of the people, there's the old, I can't remember the percentage, but uh, a large amount of people, the biggest percentage of people who have gotten bitten by venomous snakes, um, are males in their 20s and 30s who have been drinking. And what were they doing? They were trying to kill or capture the snake. Had they left that animal alone, they would never have gotten bit in the first place. Okay, so you leave them alone, and that's the best thing. These snakes aren't going to go after you, not going to bother you, anything like that. And if you do get in trouble for them, you can call if they're in your house or something like that, animal control. In many places like Arlington, for example, I know that they'll remove them or whatever. And Fairfax has a really good group, of God, now I'm forgetting their name. Oh my God. But anyway, with Marcus Ravi and so forth, that will move them for you as well. So again, these animals aren't dangerous. They're valuable. They control all sorts of different kinds of things such as rodents and whatever. They're really important to have through there. And again, as I mentioned, even the ones that don't do that do control insect numbers. And as I mentioned, wonderful bio indicators of whether or not we have a healthy woods or healthy pond or whatever. And as I mentioned, when they start to disappear, we were in trouble. So all of these things are just, it's not one thing, it's many things that people can say to kind of say they're pretty important to what's out there, and lots of good reason. And by the way, people are studying now venom, and they're coming with all sorts of brand new um, medicines based on venom of venomous snakes, and particularly the copperhead.
Next question is, you have mentioned native plants as crucial in maintaining habitat. How about water quality? Less important?
Well, of course, I planted riparian strips and things like that. Obviously, they're going to filter a few things out. They'll trap some of the larger stuff away from getting into the water and all that. So plants are very important for all these different reasons. For purifying water, for trapping things before get into water, and that's why we want vegetated strips or whatever of native plants, whatever, along many of our ponds, waterways, and all of that. So they're valuable in so many different ways, it's hard to just pick one. I'm just focusing on one big thing, and that is it, almost all of our animals, pretty much all of our animals, evolved with these plants, and therefore they depend on them. About half of our insects feed on plants, but of that half, 90% of them are specialists, meaning they only feed on one family of plants or even a particular plant. So the ones that are pests and things like that are non-natives. All the other ones, if you don't have that plant, you don't have them. there are host plants that you need for certain kinds of caterpillars. And since 96% of our land birds feed on caterpillars and all 18 of our bats, there's a little fact for you for before Bat Fest for Sunday, since they all feed on insects, you got to have these plants in order to support them. And of the 450 or more different kinds of native bees that we have in Virginia, 30% of them are allelolectic, meaning that they need the nectar of the plant that they evolved from. Nectar and pollen of the plant that they evolved from in order for them to nest. So it's all interlinked. I do a great program called Nature's Puzzle, and we talk about how everything is so interconnected. And it all starts with native plants. And we are rich in native plants. In our area, in Northern Virginia, we have about 1,700 or so native plants, and so there's a ton of native plants, all suited for different niches or whatever that you can plant, that all supports different kinds of wildlife and so forth. All sorts of native plants. And I know Alan better be agreeing with me in all this. Alan Ford over there, president of the Native Plant Society, Virginia, the Potomac chapter.
Next is a comment, and it says, outdoor cats kill these creatures.
Yeah, terrible. Outdoor cats are horrible for the environment. I do not support any TNR things. First of all, no peer-reviewed things show that these feral cat colonies, trap, neuter, release colonies ever work. Where there are tons of studies that show you they kill tons of birds, they kill all sorts of other different kinds of animals. All these things about putting bells on them doesn't help with small things like salamanders and things like that that can't get away. Helps nothing against small, doesn't help at all with baby birds. Colorful things don't help at all at night when a lot of these when cats are hunting. Plus, they carry lots of diseases. If a animal gets bit by a cat, the saliva in the cat has is toxic to it so much it gets infected very, very easily, that sometimes even with antibiotics, even within a day or so of them getting bit, the animal still dies. I mean, it's that way. And they carry all sorts of things that they sometimes, oh, well, we're vaccinating our cats or something. There are things you cannot vaccinate for, including toxic plasmosis, which has killed off other animals. There are endangered animals which are dying because of that too. So outdoor cats, indoor cats are great. My brother has a cat, all this good stuff, fine. Outdoor cats, very poor for the environment. Starts with reptiles, amphibians, goes with everything else. They're very bad for the environment. Don't support any kind of outdoor cat activities, and don't support TNR colonies for those reasons. Outdoors, they're an invasive species. Indoors, they're a great pet. Any other questions?
I'm seeing if there are any more questions. There are a lot of compliments.
Great. Well, I'm happy to hear that. So I didn't do anything that wrong. That's a good plus. So folks, again, thank you guys very much for the opportunity for me coming out here or whatever. I'm out doing a lot of different things, and again, I will be, if you do want to see me, I will be out at Wolf Trap this Sunday. I'm one of the partnering. Capital Naturalist is partnering part of the event itself. So I look forward to seeing anybody. And if you do know me, there's lots of people out there. Please just say hey, whatever, and I'm always happy to talk about that. And I love nature. It's always been my my favorite thing to do, and it'll be till the day I die, I guess. So there you go.
Can you send the recording, the link to the recording to the people who have signed up for this?
So it'll be on our website. So if you go to the Friends of Dyke Marsh website, it will be there.
Oh, the Friends of Dyke Marsh website. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
That sounded like Bernie. If it was, good to hear from you. So, folks, again, thank you very much for the invitation. Always support all the great work. There's a lot of great organizations represented out there. Thank you very much. Glenda, you and the Friends of Dyke Marsh, thank you for all the great stuff that you guys are always doing. And thank you very much for the invitation coming out here. Now I'm going to get some food and grab a beer. So there you go.
Make sure you read some of the compliments which are to you, which are in the chat first.
I'll open up. Yes.
Lots of compliments.
Oh, very cool. Well, thank you folks so much. Again, I like I said, I used to do 500 programs or something a year, and it's kind of hard now that I'm a paper pusher not doing these things. So thank you, folks. Thank you so much. That's great.
Thank you, Alonzo. That was a wonderful presentation, and we hope to be out in the field with you soon, looking for snakes and lizards and turtles, and well, maybe not this winter, but in the spring.
Anything that's out there, I'm interested in. There you
I
go.
know, and you can always find it too. That's what's so much fun. And thank you everybody for attending. Take care.
Thanks, folks.